Alright, so one of the best pieces of advice that I got when I was in school and worked on giving presentations and the like was to uh, always assume that your audience knows nothing. Even if we're talking about an audience that probably really, really cares about the thing that you're talking about. And I mean, I say that because I assume that the folks who would be listening to this probably have a pretty good idea of um, how and what, or what is and how it came to be. That it being the SNES or the Super Nintendo. I'm just going to kind of interchangeably call them between those. I, in colloquial speech, use the term Super Nintendo because that's just kind of what it was called to me when I was a child. But the SNES is kind of a more officially sort of name for it. But I think it's always good to brush up on the history when we're talking about something like this where you're celebrating the history of it, and in my case, getting all into costume for it, going with the Ness Earthbound hat, and I don't know how well you can see it, but representing with the Donkey Kong Country 3 shirt. So I just kind of want to start with a bit of a historical overview here of how this first system I was introduced on came to be. So let us turn back the clock to 1983, which sounds a little weird because the SNES here we're celebrating came out in 1991, a good 8 years later. But we need to go back to 1983, specifically in Japan, because that's where, what we know in North America and Europe, or I guess the West, saw the NES release in 1985 in North America and 1986 for Europe. So I guess happy 35th anniversary to the European NES as well. But 1983 is when the original version of both of those released in Japan, the Famicom, or the Family Computer, if you want to use the whole name for it. But not too long after that, you can imagine that if a new smartphone needs to come out every single year in the modern day, that other technological companies in the past were already working on creating better, newer hardware than what the 1983 Famicom could do. And after all, the NES was just this mere 8-bit system, so it was time to move on to what would be better than 8-bit. Would it be 12 bits? No, no, no. Would it be, well, I guess that's the only variable of 4 in between them. It would end up being 16-bit. So we would see companies like NEC, who is very much not in the console market anymore, make what we know in the West as the TurboGrafx 16 in 1989. But in 1987, they would start with the Japanese version known as the PC Engine. And then, of course, when we're talking about the 16-bit era, we have to talk about Sega. So their 16-bit console in Japan and Europe was known as the Sega Mega Drive, and that came out in 1988, and then in Europe in 1990. Us in the Americas got it in between in 1989, but for us, because for some reason the term Mega Drive was copyrighted by some other company, so we had to call it instead the Sega Genesis, which, if you ask me, is a little bit more iconic, but that's probably just some like bias of being in the place where it was called the Genesis. Which of course means if you're Nintendo and you still haven't released a 16-bit console and you're still using the 8-bit NES, you should be really working on that inevitable 16-bit system of your own. I mean, granted, along the way, it wasn't like they were completely not making any new hardware. There was the Game Boy in between, which effectively created the original, well, I shouldn't say that. It created the cartridge-based, perhaps, handheld console market. But the NES was quickly becoming less and less relevant because, I mean, it's less powerful. You can't do things quite as amazing on an 8-bit piece of hardware compared to, these new 16-bit pieces of hardware. So they're going to start losing their market, and of course that's exactly why it was time that Nintendo decided to move on to a 16-bit console, because they were losing their dominance over the market. They can't maintain that lead with this aging hardware. And so development began on what would end up being called the Super Famicom in the late 80s. We're talking about like 89, 88, 89, that sort of time. And of course, it was the final major 16-bit console to release in the year 1990 in Japan. And then Europeans would have to wait the longest. They'd have to wait until 1992 to receive the we call the Super Nintendo Entertainment System PAL version. It quite literally says PAL version in every box, game, and cartridge. So it kind of just sticks out that it's the PAL version. Whereas us North Americans received this boxy but still fine piece of hardware in 1991, August of 91. So just 9 years before I would also come into this world. And so here it is. Here I am. And, that's kind of one of the issues, I guess, of doing this pre-planned fall series of anniversary topics, is that not everything gets released in the same year. So, it's too late now for me to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Super Famicom, because that was last year. That was 2020. Ugh. And then for my European listeners, it's like I'm pulling the trigger a little too early, because for them, the Super Nintendo is synonymous with 1992, not 1991, so it'd make more sense to talk about it in 2022, but not 2021. So, but, I here am an American, so I'm going to talk about it in 2021, because console came out in 1991 here. And, the SNES, people think about consoles typically lasting 5 years, and the majority of their life is that first 5 years. It's changing a little bit, but even in the past, consoles really still stayed on the market a little longer than 5 years, even if they weren't all that relevant any longer. And that's true here for the Super Nintendo too. It stayed on the market until 1999 here in the West. But the Super Famicom, I tell you, that is one of the consoles that would not die, because it lasted 13 years. With production being discontinued in 2003. So it's kind of crazy to me to think that there were new, effectively Super Nintendos, but they were Super Famicoms being made after I was born. Because you would think that with it coming out in 1991 that you wouldn't see any anymore. And obviously that alone is impressive by itself, but it's even more impressive when you think about how the Nintendo 64, that was the successor to the SNES, released in 1996, and it only stayed on the market until 2002, so you still had Super Famicoms being made after no more Nintendo 64s were being made, which sounds wild to me. And from here on out, my goal is to focus here on this version, this boxy North American SNES, and it launched with 5 games, all of which that I think people would consider classics today. I have 3 of them. The 2 that I don't have are, or wait, did I say 5 games? I think, oh no, yeah. 5 games. There's 1 third-party title and 4 first-party titles-ish. The 2 I don't have are Konami's Gradius 3, not because it's a bad game. I've never played a Gradius, and I'm not a super big shoot-'em-up person. There's the SNES version of Simcity, which is a kind of first-party-ish game, because it's still based on Maxis and EA's Simcity, but it was developed by HAL Laboratory and published by Nintendo, so it's kind of in this weird gray zone of being the first party-ish SimCity. And then, of course, there's the 3 that I do have, which are Pilot Wings, F-Zero, and the best 2D Mario game hands down, bar none. No debate necessary, Super Mario World. And I think I'm getting close to being ready to talk about my story here with the Super Nintendo, but you can't talk the 16-bit era without going on a tangent about the console war. Now, if you think about today, in 2021, Nintendo isn't really included in the console war. In fact, today you only really see people battling about if the PS5 or the Xbox Series X is the superior console. I don't know neither of them, but then again, that's really most people, because it's so hard to get one nowadays, even if they just launched in November. But I'm largely of the opinion that if you're arguing about which box you spent $300 to $500 on is better, um, it really just contributing to a huge waste of time. And I mean, I did a whole segment on here in the past, rounding up the this ninth generation of consoles between the PlayStation 5, the Xbox Series X, and of course the Nintendo Switch, and describing how they all have unique strengths. They all have some way that their manufacturer should take advantage of them. So, I don't really have a stake in the game. I know why each one is valuable, and I could, I already have one of those three, but I could be reasonably persuaded into also owning one of the other two because they have a specific advantage that makes it unique. Um, and like I said, I know what I prefer because I already have it. And granted, it is also the cheapest, so it's the easiest to get. But like I said, the Series X and the PlayStation 5 also have their own unique advantages. I don't even want to talk about the PC Master Race business because, I mean, PC is like a whole rabbit hole in itself, and I just have this potato here, which is fine for me, but I'm probably gonna have to get something better in the near future. I don't know how near that future is, but we're gonna get off of that tangent and talk about the old school, the 16-bit console war in the early 90s. This is before you even had Sony and Microsoft even thinking of entering the market. I mean, well, I guess Microsoft is technically in it with their PC games, but Sony wasn't quite there yet as far as like making hardware. And they were close. They were going to enter a generation later and then claim dominance for good reason. But in the 16-bit era here, we're talking Sega and Nintendo. And normally when you think of console wars, and, okay, I mean, maybe this is just me. I think about kids on the playground and nowadays ridiculous people on the internet with too much free time arguing about how they spent their money better. Um, and I mean, I guess I'm hoping that today, with the advent of cross-play and how similar consoles are getting to each other, that maybe this is gonna subside a little bit. I don't know. Um, but I digress. Um, but where the SNES versus Genesis console war is different from these, cultural wars of the past is it wasn't just these random people out in the world fighting each other with words. It was the actual two companies like throwing punches and haymakers at each other, right? And that was going on through most of the era for each of these consoles. And you look at the Genesis. It was the cool console. It was for us older people because it had a lot more sports games, which are things that if you were a teenager, you probably cared about sports games a little bit more than the potentially cutesier games that you might see in the SNES. And it kept titles like the obvious one is Mortal Kombat, uncensored with all of the blood, with a code. While the wimpy SNES, you were not even allowed to have blood on the Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat, and it showed because the Genesis version outsold the Super Nintendo version by like triple. So the blood was kind of important to people for that game. But then for comparison, if you had the SNES, you had access to all of the first-party Nintendo games, which is basically the main reason that most people get the Nintendo consoles today is because they want to play the first-party games, right? If you wanted to play Super Mario World, which, as a reminder, is the best 2D Mario game, hands down, bar none, no debate necessary, you had to have the SNES. But to be fair, this was an era where it wasn't just that the first-party games were the thing that the SNES had up their sleeve. They actually still had many exclusive third-party games. You're talking your Konami games with stuff like, I already mentioned Gradius 3. There was also like Super Castlevania 4, The Legend of the Mystical Ninja. Those are some Konami games. There's the original Mega Man X trilogy, if you want to talk Capcom, Final Fight. And then, then there's even Square as well with Final Fantasy 3 and 6 and mostly Final Fantasy, but I'm sure they did other stuff too. And then kind of circling back to Capcom here, it's kind of hard to talk about the SNES without mentioning that it kind of sort of had the first home conversion of Street Fighter 2, which is the game that made fighting games like a big mainstay genre across the world. So it's kind of hard to beat. And that isn't to say that Sega was gonna just keep their take that fight sitting down, because they still were able to come back with some 1-2 punches. Because they also went ahead and decided, all right, maybe the Super Nintendo has better hardware because it came out 2 to 3 years later, depending on where you were in the world. But we can do better because we can make add-ons which make the system better. And those, in the case of Sega, they made 2 add-ons: the Sega CD, otherwise known as the Mega CD in other parts of the world, because it was still the Mega Drive in other parts of the world. And there was the 32X, but those 2 failed hard for a couple of reasons. I mean, first, of course, you had to already have a Sega Genesis to even use either of those 2 add-ons, which severely limited their audience. So, of course, if you're a developer, you probably don't want to put all of your resources into making a game specifically for the Sega CD or for the 32X, because you'd rather sell to the whole Sega Genesis audience rather than, oh, let's sell to this percentage of the larger Genesis audience that just so happens to own the 32X. And not to mention, when we're talking about the Sega CD games, a lot of them were FMV games, which, I mean, not to completely besmirch a genre, but they're usually not all that great. And then, if you're lucky, maybe a Sega CD game could be an enhanced version of a game already on the Genesis. I don't know. I don't think I have it anymore. We're gonna go through the games I have. That I own on the SNES here, but I don't think I have this one anymore. But we used to have, I think it was Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure on the SNES, and there was a version of that on the Sega Genesis, but there was also a version of the Sega CD. And the main big difference with that, of course, was the Red Book audio. But is that really a big enough difference from the other versions to justify also having a Sega CD on top of it? And then the latter is true for the 32X as well, is that you'd have, if you were lucky, you might get some enhanced games for it. And then, of course, there were the Sega CD 32X games that required you to own both the 32X and the Sega CD, so, I mean, if you're already talking about limiting to the portion of the audience that owns the Sega CD, or you're limiting to the audience that owns the 32X, now just imagine you have to cater to that teeny, weeny, tiny overlap between the 2. And then, of course, we can't talk about add-ons without talking about the prices. So the Sega CD cost $2.99 at launch. And just for context, that might sound like, I mean, that doesn't sound too entirely unreasonable. After all, you gotta look at things like how much the PlayStation VR is. Well, the Genesis itself was $189. You have an add-on that costs more than the main console. And then the 32X launched at, a more reasonable $169, so at least it cost less than the Genesis. And it quickly fell from there because the Genesis was already on its last legs, and the 32X was its very, very last hurrah. So, I mean, if you were that poor sap who bought all of those pieces of hardware at launch, you would have paid $657 before taxes, which is a lot of money. And again, that already sounds like a lot, but in 2021 dollars, that's $1,100. So that's a lot of money to pay for 3 pieces of hardware with only one that gives you a lot of value, and the other 2 maybe giving you some value if you're really, really going to spend all of the money on that collection. It's not like Nintendo they were prepared to make this mistake too, and I mean, they still ended up making a mistake either way, because they wanted to make a CD add-on here for the Super Nintendo. But ironically, not releasing that SNES CD was just as much of a mistake, because the company that Nintendo was going to partner with to make the CD add-on was Sony, and they're going to make this add-on for the SNES called the PlayStation. And so, essentially, the long story short of that is, you might not have PlayStation at all today if Nintendo just stuck with Sony. Although, like I said, the Nintendo PlayStation, which is a very wrong phrase if you ask me, is a whole bigger story that, if I'm feeling particularly historical in an episode, I might talk about one day. But it was still worth addressing it in brief here. I cannot get over the irony. It's like if you just stuck with Sony, you wouldn't have effectively made the best-selling console brand that isn't your own console brand. And even still, it's not like Nintendo also didn't do any hardware innovation that console warriors back in the day used in their arguments for why the Super Nintendo was better, because built into the SNES was this Mode 7 technology. So this is like a particular mode that the SNES could go in that allowed its sprites to be twisted around and stretched and flattened, which allowed games like two of those launch titles, F-Zero and Pilot Wings, to be possible. You could see games like that on the Genesis, but it would be more challenging to do that sort of effect than it would be to do on the SNES. And then later games like Star Fox, which is one we're going to talk about here, used the Super FX chip. So that was an add-on for certain games that allowed the SNES to render a very primitive 3D models. And when I'm talking primitive, I'm talking like more or less wireframe models with colors in between. I mean, I guess that's not entirely fair. There's some games like Stunt Race FX that use it a little bit more effectively than that. And obviously, if Nintendo wanted to, they could have made the Super FX like an actual additional piece of hardware for the SNES. But simply making it a chip that would go into the cartridges, I mean, I don't know, maybe I should, I'm not sure how much of the credit for the Super FX needs to go to Argonaut Games, since they were really the developer behind Star Fox. But I digress. Making the Super FX be just a chip that goes in the cartridges is not only a lot easier, it's a lot cheaper, because obviously if you only need the one additional chip, it doesn't pay to make a whole separate piece of hardware, and then it also means that, unlike with say the 32X, now the Super FX games are playable by the whole SNES owning market. So you weren't limiting the sales of Star Fox or the sales of Stunt Race FX or of, I don't know, Yoshi's Island uses it. You weren't limiting those games to just the Super FX owning market, because everyone had a Super FX chip in their games. And then I guess along the way there's also the Super FX chip 2, which, that was the Yoshi's Island chip. And it was also in games like Winter Gold, which is the rare European-only game. And I mean, there's plenty of other add-ons here that I can discuss and talk about, but I feel like I've gone on enough of a tangent here on like add-ons. Really, the point that I wanted to make here in talking about the console wars is merely that Sega and Nintendo themselves felt like they had to get into the fight to show people that our system is better, and you should really get yours. And I'm saying in a different way from just marketing that you have the better system, because obviously as a company your goal is to make profit and therefore prove that you have the better system. So at this point, that I've gone over just kind of the informationally bits, it's time to get a little bit more improvisational, because we're going to talk about my own experiences with the SNES, just talking about all of the games. And I planned on going in alphabetical order here, but I figure it's only appropriate that we start with the best 2D Mario game of all time, hands down, no questions asked, no debate necessary. I said that wrong, even though I've written it down like twice. We're going to talk Super Mario World. Now, I remember talking in the first episode here about... Now, I keep dropping it. What were some of my first games? And, of course, two of the three I mentioned were Donkey Kong Country and Super Mario World. I mean, and I've been calling it the best 2D Mario game, hands down. No debate necessary. Why can't I remember the middle part of this little diatribe? And there's a reason for it. And for me, it all comes down to control. People talk about, well, which one's better, Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World? And for whatever reason, people seem to think Mario 3 is better, and I'm just going to put it out there, they're wrong. Because Super Mario Bros. 3, in my opinion, controls horribly. To me, it's just too loose of a game, where I cannot feel confident in most of my jumps. But Super Mario World has like the tightest possible jumping controls out there, where if I feel like I can make a jump, I will make that jump without any problem. Now, to be fair, I mean, I guess having the cape feather in the game helps a lot, and it blows the Tanuki leaf out and the Tanuki suit out of the water, because with the cape feather you can just hold down the jump button, whereas with the raccoon leaf and the Tanuki suit you have to constantly tap the button to try to slow your descent periodically. But I digress. I don't want to completely turn this into a dunking on Super Mario Brothers 3 session here and talk about Super Mario World. There's a lot of other things that the game did well that aren't just it being superior to Mario 3. Of course, it added Yoshi, which was, a type of character that the developers had wanted to include all the way back in the original Super Mario Brothers, but they just couldn't do it at the time. Hardware wasn't quite there, which I somewhat call, as a Pat's been saying lately in the CU podcast, I call Bravo Sierra on, because even the little like educational games were able to include, or like the Mario's Missing had Luigi riding Yoshi. But granted, I mean, I guess I don't know if that's so fair of a comparison, because those came out in the late 80s, early 90s, where Super Mario Brothers was 1985. They probably weren't the full extent of the NES's capabilities weren't visible, or weren't easily I can't think of a good way to say this. They weren't easily realized in 85, even if it had been out for 2 years, the original Famicom version at least. I suppose one of the great innovations in Mario World was having the game feel connected along the way. There were very few, say, ice levels, because you wouldn't find an ice level in the middle of Donut Plains. You go from Yoshi's Island to Donut Plains, both really grassy worlds, and then you'd go into a cave, and what do you find in a cave? Vanilla Dome. And what's a Vanilla Dome all about? Oh yeah, cave levels, and I guess the occasional ice level, because to be fair, it does get really cold in caves. Until eventually going through the bridge levels. Where in Mario 3 you had a single, maybe a couple screens layout of a world. In Mario World, Super Mario World on the SNES, everything would flow together into like one quite literal line that the brothers would travel along on. Let's see, you had, it was the first Mario game with a save feature. That was huge, and if anything, that's a major reason to me why Super Mario World is elevated over all other Mario games, is that you could save it for the first time. You had the addition of fully secret levels and multiple exits for a level, where past games, I mean, I guess you technically had secret exits in Mario 3 with things like finding the warp whistle in the first tower of World 1. But I think that's kind of a tenuous secret exit. Whereas in Super Mario World, you would find keys throughout some of the levels that would quite literally have a keyhole somewhere in the level that you could put it in, and lo and behold, now you're going on a different route. The game even signals which levels only have one exit and which ones have two exits or more, which I did not realize when I was a kid, but once someone told me this, I was like, oh my goodness, that makes so much sense. The yellow dot levels are one exit, and the red dot levels have more than one exit. But I digress. It added like the switch palaces. Again, just another way of finding more routes in the same level to ultimately be able to finish it. It added things like the Star Road, which I figure I don't need to put a spoiler for, because I would hope it's common knowledge right already, the existence of the Star Road in Super Mario World. So it was really a game that, to an extent, rewarded you for going for everything, even though it only had 96 exits instead of 100 exits, so 100% was really 96. I'm not sure where to keep going on Super Mario World. I'm so personally attached to that game that it's hard to be like an objective arbiter of how good of a game it is. I just it mostly comes down to how good those controls were. If the controls in the game were not what they are, I don't think I would like it as much as I would possibly potentially like that accursed Super Mario Brothers 3. Anyway, from here on out, we're going to actually go in alphabetical order with the games that I own. Starting, let's see, I have a few columns here, or a few stacks, maybe. Stack's probably a better word of games I own. Oh, come on. And some of these, I guess, aren't even technically my games. They're the games that from my father's collection. So some of these really aren't going to be talked about very much, and some of these are going to get talked about extensively. Like, this is one that's probably not going to get talked about much. This is Arkanoid Do It Again, which is, as you can imagine, it's Arkanoid. And if you don't know what Arkanoid is, I would hope you know what Breakout is, because Arkanoid is Breakout, but in space. Or at least it looks like it's in space, so it's kind of the aesthetic of it. And there's some kind of story to it, but it really doesn't make sense. But hey, I mean, all I care about is just Breakout, and it's fun. And that's all I really need from it is fun and Breakout. I haven't played it a ton. I can't really get past much more than the first level, because as much as I love games, I kind of suck at games. Let's see. Oh, here's definitely not my game, but one that I grew up with nonetheless. This is Brunswick World Tournament of Champions, which is a, would you believe it's a bowling game? That's all I really can say about it. You bowl in it. I don't know. Maybe I can kind of talk about my opinions on 2D versus 3D sports games. 2D sports games generally kind of are not that great, and this is no exception. Only because, for whatever reason, back in the day, when developers made sports games, especially ones like this, which kind of go for the arcadey sort of three-click style, they just had to really speed up that bar that you would use for no apparent reason, and it would really, really irritate me, because that makes the game significantly harder. Now for this next one, I'm pulling out 3, because we're talking about Donkey Kong Country, and Donkey Kong Country 2, and Donkey Kong Country 3, which is what the shirt is for. And when we're talking Donkey Kong Country, I have to be honest here. The only game in this series that I associate with the Super Nintendo is the original. The one Donkey Kong Country #1. And that was because this is actually the only one that I had when I was a kid. When it came to playing Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, these two games here, I actually played those first on the Game Boy Advance rather than the SNES, even though they came out on the SNES first. So, Donkey Kong Country, man, I quite enjoy this game. If I were looking at things objectively, I would probably call it the weakest of the trilogy, but it kind of has the right to be the weakest, purely because it's the first one. It's a game, of course it's a platformer, kind of like Super Mario World, but it tries to go, it leans a lot heavier into this idea of the bonus room, which is fun, if you ask me, to try to find areas in the level where you can play a little extra micro sort of game in the middle as you're going through the stage, but where Donkey Kong Country 1 kind of fails, where Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3 succeed, is that Donkey Kong Country 1 hardly signals its bonus areas. So let me give a good example. Actually, let me give a bad example first, I guess. So in the first level, in Jungle Hijinks, in Congo Jungle, when you get Rambi the Rhino, you're essentially just kind of running along, and eventually you reach a wall that you break it open, and there's a bonus room for you to go in. It's probably the easiest one to find. But if you just decided at the wrong time to jump past it, you wouldn't have had any idea there's a bonus room there, now would you? And then there's other instances throughout the game where bonus barrels, they really didn't have a ton of bonus barrels, where like bonus rooms aren't signed very well, in that there's going to be one there, because a lot of bonus areas are just in walls, and Donkey Kong Country 2, on the other hand, employed the bonus barrel, like a specially marked, that's the word I'm looking for, marked barrel that would say, hey, there's a bonus area here. Whereas Donkey Kong Country 1 would just use the automatic, I can't think of the word, the automatic, like, shooting, blasting barrels for if they had a barrel out in the wild that would take you to a bonus level. But at the same time, I cannot deny my nostalgia for the original Donkey Kong Country and how I think it's a fantastic game. It's also probably the hardest of the three, if only because Donkey Kong is a much more situational character compared to Diddy Kong. You kind of want to play as Diddy Kong in it, if only to continue going faster. I apologize. I'm probably giving very terrible descriptions of all of these games, but I'm trying to fit in a description of like 23 games into here, so I don't want to go into super big detail about any of them. If anything, there might be a Donkey Kong episode at some point where I talk about all three games in more detail. But if I honestly had to pick which one of the three I actually like the least, it's going to be Donkey Kong Country 2, which most people are probably shocked about that because Donkey Kong Country 2 is considered the fan favorite, and of the original trilogy, my favorite is actually probably Donkey Kong Country 3. I know, blasphemy. And honestly, it's because, for as great as Donkey Kong Country 2 is, it just kind of lacks something for me. I can't quite put my finger on what it is, because, again, there's so much about Donkey Kong Country 2 that it keeps from Donkey Kong Country 1 that's fantastic. Like, they all clearly have similar DNA. But I think where Donkey Kong Country 3 succeeds for me is that it constantly keeps me on my toes, like, every level and I guess this is true of Donkey Kong Country 2 as well. There are very few what I would call generic levels in this original trilogy of games. There are very few levels that just are a jungle level, or are, just a water level. They don't have anything unique about them, because one of the goals with this game was to make entirely unique levels. You go to Clam City. What do you find in Clam City in Donkey Kong Country 1 for that underwater level? Oh, it's populated with clams that shoot pearls at you. So that's the gimmick of the level. You go to Web Woods in Donkey Kong Country 2. Well, you're going to play as Squitter the Spider in it and shoot webs to create platforms in the woods. Go to Donkey Kong Country 3 here and play, what's a good one? If you play Ripsaw Rage, it's a tree level where you're not only going through giant trees, you're also being chased by a giant saw along the way. And in that sense, all of these levels are memorable, but they're not all perfectly amazing levels. Again, I don't want to, it's hard to improvise talking about games, especially in short versions. Sometimes I wish I had small, tiny collections so I could just go on and on and on and on about the same game, but I also don't want to get super boring. So let's talk about F-Zero, and F-Zero is the next one in this alphabetical list, and it's so sad. This game itself is not sad. This game is actually really, really good. It's sad that the series hasn't had a new game in, 15 plus years. So F-Zero is a futuristic racing game. In fact, probably one, if not the first, one of the first of its kind. And so essentially you take, there are four racing machines that you can choose from with characters associated with them, but you don't really get to choose the character. You're not choosing Captain Falcon, you're choosing the Blue Falcon. You're not choosing Dr. Stewart, you're choosing the Golden Fox. And, I mean, it's a racing game. It's just really, really fast. And that's kind of the conceit of the game, is that, it's the first one of the first Mode 7 games. So if you compare, say, Rad Racer to it, it feels like a very different sort of game, because in F-Zero, like F-Zero looks three-dimensional without actually being three-dimensional. Uh, I don't know how to describe it. It's just, well, actually, I guess one of the other conceits of F-Zero 2 is that it's really, really hard. It's not any, none of the games are really easy, but I would actually contend that the easiest of like the three console F-Zero games, well, it's kind of a toss-up between the SNES one and F-Zero X, to be honest. I would probably, I guess my heart wants to go with F-Zero X, but I also feel like I've probably made the most progress in the SNES game, even if it doesn't really save any progress. I think it only really saves best times in the time trial mode. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's a fun game. It's a classic SNES game for a reason. Because it's fun to race fast, and I think it'd also be fun to race fast with 3D models in high definition on a giant TV. Just kind of saying. And no, I'm not the only one who said it. I know it's not an original thought, but God, we need a new F-Zero game. So let's move on to stack number 2. There's only really 5 games. Oh my goodness! Each of these stacks here that I have planned. Let's talk about Kirby. Kirby isn't a series that I've really talked about very much on here. Kirby Superstar, that's the game in question here. There were a couple of Kirby games on the SNES, and most of them, for whatever reason, came out like at the tail end of the console's life. Kirby Superstar being one of them. And for whatever reason, Kirby Superstar is considered like the quintessential Kirby game. Now, don't get me wrong, I do also quite enjoy the game, but I don't know if I would quite call it my favorite Kirby game. I do firmly believe that for many series, whichever one is the first one you play ends up being everyone's favorite, and for me that's still the first 3DS Kirby game, Triple Deluxe. But I mean, in some ways I also have to give Kirby Superstar credit, because those games wouldn't exist. Some of these modern Kirby games wouldn't exist if it weren't for Kirby Superstar, because a lot of their DNA comes directly from this game. It was the first Kirby game to include having copy abilities that do multiple actions depending on how you, which direction you have the D-pad facing and how many times you hit the buttons. Whereas like in Kirby's Adventure and Kirby's Dream Land 2, and even many succeeding Kirby games, every copy ability would only do one thing. If you got fire, you would shoot fire breath, and that was it. Well, in Kirby Superstar, if you have the fire ability, and you can shoot fire breath if you just hit the attack button once, but you can also dash and turn into a flaming ball and shoot forward. If you have if you have the sword ability, you won't just swing your sword forward, you can also do an uppercut and a downward thrust like Link, to the point where you wear a little hat. This was also the Kirby game that originated the hats for all the copy abilities. And the big conceit with Kirby Superstar is that, I mean, as it says, it's 8 games in one, which is like true, but not at the same time. I mean, a couple of them are really just mini games. There's the arena and the true arena, which is just a boss rush of all the enemies from the other modes. I mean, one of the 8 games in Kirby Superstar is Spring Breeze. But Spring Breeze is just a remake of Kirby's Dream Land on the Game Boy, but now you get to actually use copy abilities in it. And really all that Kirby Superstar does is it takes the base mechanics of Kirby, or in this case, with some of the special bonuses that Superstar allows, and forces you to play each version in a slightly different way. If you're playing Spring Breeze, you're playing traditional Kirby. You're going through 5 levels, getting to the end, beating the bosses. But if you're playing The Revenge of Meta Knight, now instead you're going through one slightly bigger level, but you have to beat it under a certain time limit. If you're playing The Great Cave Offensive, which for me is offensive, because it's basically a Metroidvania, and that's scary, instead of going through different levels, you're going through like 4 giant, again, Metroid-style areas. And I mean, I'm glad I have the SNES version, but part of me really wishes instead I'd gone with the DS version, Kirby Superstar Ultra, because not only does that include the base it includes all the stuff that's in Kirby Superstar. It also has some of its own unique stuff, and I'm really not prepared to buy Kirby Superstar again, but on the DS. I mean, I guess I shouldn't count that option out though, because it's not like I haven't bought the same game twice before in a quite more literal fashion. But I don't know, something. For whatever reason, I really have been averse to getting Kirby Superstar Ultra, and really a lot of other DS Kirby games. Like I don't think I have a single DS Kirby game, which is surprising because I have a lot of the 3DS Kirby games, as well as the small handful that are out on Switch now. But let's move on to something different. Let's talk Ms. Pac-Man. Now, Ms. Pac-Man probably seems like a weird idea to have as an SNES game because it came out in like 1982 or 3, the original arcade version. So why would you want your brand new 16-bit console to have a really old arcade game on it? And I'll be honest, I actually haven't been able to play this version of Ms. Pac-Man because for whatever reason the stupid cartridge won't work. I think I just need to clean off the connectors. I really hope that's all I need to do because I'd really like to actually play it. But this version, and the Sega Genesis version to be fair, actually includes some pretty unique features compared to most other versions of Ms. Pac-Man, which, if you're lucky, is a straight arcade conversion. This version is actually two-player. And I don't mean two-player in the arcade, like how in the arcade you'd have to switch between players when one of them dies. I mean, you can have two Pac-Men, Ms. Pac-Man and Pac-Man, just Pac-Man, playing on the same map. You can set the speeds. Like, if you're like me and you prefer it being a slower Ms. Pac-Man, you can play the slightly slower Ms. Pac-Man. But if you're like my dad, who loved the really fast Ms. Pac-Man, you can set it to be really fast. And lo and behold, there's a lot of there's a lot of people who, if you ask them which version of Ms. Pac-Man they would recommend, they'd probably go with the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis version, if only because of all of this unique customization. It's one of the few times where home conversion is, in some ways, better than the arcade version. Not that the arcade version is bad, but this version is unique in the special abilities it allows you. And then we have NBA Jam. Now, this is actually a sports game that I do have some nostalgia for. Like, if I had to pick if someone were to make me play a sports game, I would say, could we play NBA Jam, maybe? And it's not even because I love basketball, although if I were to pick a sport that I would willingly watch on television, the one that I would maybe go for is basketball. It's because it takes basketball and makes it not realistic. And that's kind of what I need out of my sports games, is to not, need to know all the intricacies of the game and all the ins and the outs. Here you just have two people who will knock each other down and light the basketball net on fire with their flaming basketball because they can throw it really, really hard. And to be fair, I can't say I know the same intricacies with NBA Jam that some other people do. It's not the most nostalgic game for me, but it's a sports game that I grew up playing and actually really liked, which is more than I can say for the Electronic Arts PGA Tour Golf, which is not a bad game, but it's clearly the first EA Sports golf game. It's pre-calling it Tiger Woods PGA Golf. And again, it's certainly not like a bad game, but it's just kind of a golf game. It's a game I have mostly because it's from my parents' original collection. And I still like it, but I can't say that I am commonly clamoring to pop in EA Sports Presents PGA Tour Golf. Moving on, the last game I have in this stack is Space Invaders, which is sadly just Space Invaders. I think it's in color, which is kind of unique. But really the more interesting Space Invaders from this area wasn't the Super Nintendo version, it was the Game Boy version. And not even because it was Space Invaders on the go, but ironically, the reason the Game Boy Space Invaders is interesting is because of the Super Nintendo. Because if you plugged that version into the Super Game Boy, which is one accessory I did not talk about in my discussion here. We'll save that for another day, actually, I guess. You would actually get to play the arcade version of Space Invaders rather than the Game Boy version. That's right, the Game Boy version of Space Invaders is a completely different version of Space Invaders loaded onto it for when you plugged it into the Super to Game Boy on the Super Nintendo. What a world. But kind of like Arkanoid, I don't have a ton to say about Space Invaders because it's Space Invaders. You're a tank shooting at aliens, and if you're really bad at it, like me, or kind of more like a chicken, I guess, you try shooting through the barriers, which basically means you're just killing your own barriers, which is bad strategy. And I think we have one more stack and a half here to go through. Oh, come on. Starting with Star Fox, which I think is one of the few Super FX games I own. I really don't own a ton of Super FX chip games, but this is one. This is one of them. I tell ya, I really want to like Star Fox, the Super Nintendo game to be specific, but I can only really like Star Fox 64 and beyond. And first off, because kind of like Super Mario Bros. 3, this game doesn't save. And I would play it more if it's saved. Also, the game kind of plays like a slideshow on the original SNES. I've played it a little bit on the SNES Classic, as well as, a lot of these games, I will admit, I have not booted up their cartridge versions in a while, because they're also available on Switch Online, and it's just a lot easier for me to pull that out than it is to turn on the SNES. But at least I can make a save function in the Switch Online version of Star Fox, and I don't think, if I remember correctly, it plays quite as badly as the original cartridge version, but my goodness, is it slow. And that just kind of makes the levels drag on. Also, and I don't know if it's just me, but my aim is horrible in the SNES Star Fox, whereas if you plop me down in front of Star Fox 64, well, to be fair, more so the 3DS version, because that's the version I own, I would be able to shoot down, baddies without any problem. So again, it's a game I want to love, but a game I just can't love, because it's so the first Star Fox for sure. And speaking of Super FX games, let's talk about Stunt Race FX. Now, I've brought this up a couple of times. It's one of the first 3D racing games in the sense that you are going around fully 3D model areas, and in my experience, Stunt Race FX actually renders a lot more smoothly than Star Fox does, and I suppose that's a good thing because this came after Star Fox, and it is a racing game. Racing games are notoriously actually pretty easy games for consoles to handle. I'm not sure why. I think I heard an explanation one time, but I honestly cannot remember. I can't say I have a ton of nostalgia for Stunt Race FX because, again, that's one of those games that I got after the fact. I would say that, at this point, there's only really two more games in this whole group here that are ones that are from my childhood. All the rest are games that I ended up getting after the fact to really round out the SNES collection. I've played the races a little bit, and I'm much better at Stunt Race FX than I am at our next game here, which is also a racing game. I think I'm better at F-Zero than I am at Stunt Race. But Stunt Race definitely still has some of the trappings of the original Super FX chip that make it kind of weak. Primarily that it doesn't render things super duper well. As far as there are some races that, for example, are in a cave, or I think it's in an underwater tunnel area of some kind, and you're driving along and you're going into the tunnel and bam, wall. Where'd that wall come from? I was not prepared for that, and oh my gosh, now all of a sudden I'm super behind. I have turbo here, but I have a limited amount of turbo that I can use up, so now I'm just going to get behind and end up losing the race because I didn't know that wall was coming. That's the Stunt Race FX experience, in my opinion. but it's still, I don't know if it's better or as good as Super Mario Kart. Super Mario Kart, I tell ya, what a game. It's the first Mario Kart, and man, does it feel like it. It's fun, don't get me wrong. I would argue that Super Mario Kart is leagues better than Mario Kart 64, by a long shot, but it's also not a great game either. You're limited to your 8 characters, and like Mario Kart 64, Super Mario Kart's Achilles heel is its controls. I tell ya, Super Mario Kart is similar in that it's a game I want to love, but it's so hard to love because its controls are just so weak. Specifically the turning. That game is like wide turn central. I just want to go around this tight turn that they have on the map, but now I'm like going all the way off into the grass. And let's not even talk about drifting, because drifting in Super Mario Kart is so similarly, like, I feel like I've got it down better than I used to, but it's still not great. I don't know. And it's also very limited in that, like, most of the tracks use the same aesthetic. If I remember correctly, there's 4 Mario circuits. The only track layout that, or not the layout, but the aesthetic that doesn't repeat is Rainbow Road. There's 2 Vanilla Lakes. There's, like, similarly 4 Bowser Castles. And it gets pretty samey after a while. Fortunately, all the tracks are unlocked from the outset, so you can very easily go into the Grand Prix and just race. Although it is weird in that Super Mario Kart and Mario Kart 60... No, maybe it's Super Circuit. I know for sure Super Mario Kart and Super Circuit make you come in 4th or better if you want to keep going through the Grand Prix, whereas the other games just kind of let you keep going, even if you're failing real hard. Here's another game that I thought I wouldn't have, but I ended up getting as a gift. It's Super Mario RPG. It's the only RPG, actually, that I own on the SNES, which probably sounds a little weird, because there's some people, when they think of the Super Nintendo, and all they think of is RPGs. Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy, Breath of Fire. Those are all major RPGs. Neither of the Dragon Quests that were on the SNES ended up coming to the West. Neither 5 or 6, but that's a couple more RPGs that are on the system. Actually, when I think of the SNES, I genuinely still think of a lot of the platforming games, if only because I have so many of them, and there's a lot of still cutesy character platformers on the console. But Super Mario RPG kind of bridges that gap. It was called Super Mario RPG, if only because it was the first Super Mario role-playing game. You didn't have Paper Mario yet. You didn't have Mario and Luigi yet, because this game had to set the standards for, well, what are we going to have in a Mario RPG? What's going to is it going to be fully traditional turn-based? No, not quite. Is it going to be an action RPG? No, also not quite. It's going to be turn-based, but you're going to do action-timed attacks along the way, to somewhat simulate that Mario-y feel. When you go around the overworld, you can actually still jump around areas and hit blocks as if it were a plain Jane Mario game, but in an isometric view instead of in a top-down view, or in a traditional 2D Mario view at the time. It's a game that I haven't finished yet. I think the farthest I've gotten is like in the sewers, that sort of area. Again, it's a game I like, but it's not a game that I love in the same way that some people just really, really love Super Mario RPG. But one game that I do love for my child is, of all games, Super Off-Road, the Baja. Now, I actually don't know how much relation this game has to the other Super Off-Road games, because this is a little bit of a series. All it really is a truck racing game, and it's fun, and it's fast, and that's all I really needed from it. Dang it. That's all I wanted. And it was another one of those games that I played with my dad a bunch when I was a very little kid, and lo and behold, I have a ton of nostalgia for it. But a game that I don't have a lot of nostalgia for, even though it was from our original collection, was Super Tennis. This is a game that I've actually played a lot more on the Switch Online service, and I found that I enjoy it enough. It kind of has the problem, again, of other sports games of that, like, the AI is too good in it. It's too good for my puny human ability to fight it off. It also doesn't help that a lot of 2D tennis games suck in that I always want to see everything from behind, and inevitably it makes me go be in the back, and therefore reverses my movement controls, which is not fun. Wario's Woods is more famous for probably being the last NES game than it is for anything else, and dropping things. And Wario's Woods is just a confusing mess of a puzzle game. It's a game that similarly I want to like, but I just don't understand how to play it. And I guess that actually gets to one of the problems with buying Super Nintendo games in the modern day is it's a lot harder because you don't have the manual to go with it. If you want to learn how to play Wario's Woods, you have to go and watch a video tutorial on the internet, which is fine, but I think it would be a lot more fun if I didn't have to go out and go get additional resources to understand the game. It should be understandable enough without that, if you ask me. But a game that I do find understandable enough without manual and is still a puzzle game is Yoshi's Cookie. Now you would think that Yoshi's Cookie, for being a Yoshi game, would be a first-party game, but no, it's actually in a way kind of a third-party game because it wasn't actually developed by Nintendo. It was developed by, it looks like, Bulletproof Software and was ended up licensed by them. And it's a puzzle game where you have a bunch of these cookies all in like a giant stack, and using Mario's levers on the side, you get to get Yoshi to eat them by lining up all of the same kind of cookie in a row or a column. And it's simple and it's fun. And again, sometimes that's all you need out of a puzzle game. Now this brings me to my last couple of games, and there's one that I'm realizing that I know I have, but I guess I didn't have it on the shelf there. I'm not sure where it went. We'll talk about that last, I guess. First, let's talk about Yoshi's Island, otherwise known as Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. But even the top of the cartridge calls it Yoshi's Island because it's just Yoshi's Island. It has nothing to do with Mario. And my first DS game was Yoshi's Island DS. And that's really where I have the bulk of my nostalgia for Yoshi, the Yoshi series. And man, Yoshi's Island is a game that I want to love, and I think is actually kind of easy when you're just kind of going through a casual playthrough of it, but man, Yoshi games are like the ultimate 100% game if you're a masochist. Because there's so much stuff you have to do in a single stage. You have to get your your 5 smiley flowers, you have to get your 20 red coins, and of course you have to also do it without getting hit a single time by any enemy, which is a lot easier said than done, especially in the original Yoshi's Island. It can be a real hard game. Now fortunately, you do get these items that let you add time to your star timer, because that's essentially your health in the game. You want to have all 30 seconds on the star timer. So it's kind of easier in that sense, but it's still not a very easy game to get a 100%, which is fine. 100% should be a challenge, but this is one of them. Now I have one boxed SNES game here. I have hardly played it. It's Pac-Man 2, The New Adventures, which is actually notoriously, apparently, a terrible Pac-Man game, because it's kind of like a point-and-click adventure where you let Pac-Man just kind of do whatever he wants, and there's a reason I actually still haven't popped it into the console, because I'm not prepared for that, especially when, again, like so many other games, it doesn't save. Dang companies, just spring for the battery in your game. Now the game that I just realized that isn't in my stack here is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I know we have it because I've played it, and again, I much prefer 2D Zelda. I really want to reserve my discussion for it for when I do the Zelda episode, since that's going to be an episode. I didn't really want to reveal the chronology when these are being recorded, but yes, this is being recorded before the Zelda episode. And I like it, but I prefer A Link Between Worlds. I'm just going to leave it at that for now. There's reason it's considered a classic Zelda, and I would argue the far superior classic Zelda compared to all of the others. But that's really not where my SNES collection ends, because we have to talk about some SNES-inspired stuff. Well, actually, let's start with these. You might have noticed I don't have any Mega Men on the SNES, but that's because I've got these. And I guess really the classic collection doesn't have a ton of SNES games, because the only SNES Mega Man of the classic series was Mega Man 7. And I haven't even touched it yet because I want to finish the 8-bit games, and right now I'm still in the middle of Mega Man 3. But I have touched the Mega Man X Legacy collection as far as the original Mega Man X. And I mean, at least all three of the... well, there's 4 games in the first Legacy collection, and all of those are SNES games. All the rest are... PlayStation 1, a PlayStation, and a couple of PlayStation 2 X games, and that's really where I've played them. I don't really want to do a Mega Man discussion here because I feel like that fits better in a Mega Man themed episode. But for as much as people like Mega Man X, I am not too impressed yet, and maybe that's just because I'm not very good at it. But I think as I improve with the game, I'll end up liking the Mega Man X series better, for as much as it's a classic SNES series. So that covers my experience with the SNES, and I just made a real big mess here on the floor right next to me. But I'll have to clean that up whenever I'm done recording this.